like the trickle has slowed down a bit, so we'll go ahead and get started. We are recording this. We are streaming this on Facebook, so thank you for joining us wherever you are. My name is Jess Royer. I'm here from WAC, and we have Ron Granieri with us today. I'm going to start off with an intro video, and then we'll get into it. As always, thank you for being here. The World Affairs Council of Greater Reading is the leading educational organization promoting understanding and enlightenment on global issues. We appreciate all of your attendance today. I think it's going to be a great session. I'm going to turn it over to Dave Bean, who's going to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Jess. And it is a privilege to welcome our speaker today, Ron Granieri, who is no stranger to the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading. Ron having addressed us on numerous occasions in the past. His topic today is extremely timely. He's going to offer his perspectives on the upcoming German election. As you all know, Angela Merkel is not standing for re-election. This will be the first time in many, many years that the Federal Republic of Germany will have a new chancellor, which will be impactful in terms of the relationship of Germany and the EU with the United States and the world at large. Just to give some folks a perspective on Ron, as I said, he is no stranger to us, but just by way of background, he is a Foreign Policy Research Institute Templeton Fellow, the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Research Institute Center for the Study of America and the West, editor of the center's e-publication, The American Review of Books, Blogs, and Bull, and he is host of Geopolitics with Granieri, a monthly series of events for Foreign Policy Research Institute members. Ron is a specialist in contemporary German and international history with degrees from both Harvard and the University of Chicago. He is the recipient of a Federal Chancellor Scholarship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and is a member in the American Council on Germany's Young Leader Program. He has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Temple University, my law school alma mater, Syracuse, Furman University, and the University of Tübingen. He is the author of The Ambivalent Alliance, Konrad Adenauer, the CDU, CSU, and the West, 1949 to 1966, and is currently completing a book entitled The Fall and Rise of German Christian Democracy from Détente to Reunification. It is with great pleasure that I welcome back to the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading, Ron Granieri.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everybody. It's really very nice to be here. Also, my one other addition, because you can tell that I hope Room Raider doesn't get at me for having such a mess behind me on my shelves, but I'm coming to you from my office at the U.S. Army War College, where I'm also a professor of history, and I am compelled to say that nothing that I say, that my opinions are all my own, and that none of them should be considered to be the opinions of the United States Army, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Army War College, or anybody else except mine. I don't think anybody else would want to claim them. But it's delightful to be here with all of you, and it's really nice to be here to talk about this interesting question. I mean, the world's a complicated place, and there's always something new going on. And the temptation that specialists in international affairs often fall into is they will tell their neighbors, well, you know, what you really need to understand is X, or, you know, there's this topic that nobody else is talking about. And, you know, we can all be forgiven for not being up to date on everything. And so but it's good to have a chance to, in the midst of lots of other problems in the world, to look at one of the developments that is both normal and controversial at the same time, and that is democratic elections in a state that is allied with the United States. Right? We are aware of the leaders of other states, but we're not necessarily always aware of the mechanics of how those leaders are chosen or the domestic politics of places. And so today we're going to talk about Germany. I've got some slides to show just so that you don't have to look at me and my stacks of papers. But I'm going to talk for a little bit, but I also want to make sure that there's plenty of time for discussion. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I'm going to pretend that I've gotten good at this. I think I managed to at least do that. So some perspectives on the upcoming German elections. The elections will take place next month. They will take place on Sunday. I meant to double check. I want to say Sunday, September 12th, because the Germans vote on Sundays, right? That's something that is much more common in Europe than it is other places. They vote on Sundays, and generally speaking, they have higher vote turnout. You know, those two things might go together, but that's something we can talk about in the questions as well. So 3 big questions that we're going to consider in this discussion. And if I don't hit them all, I hope that you'll hit me back with them. And that they are basically what's at stake in the upcoming German elections, who are the candidates, and why should we in the United States care? It's a big change. As Dave said, right, we are saying goodbye to Angela Merkel, whose political career it essentially mirrors the fate of reunified Germany. Merkel was not a political person. She was initially a scientist, an academic who got into politics during the German Revolution of 1989-1990, who then joined the Christian Democratic Union, or CDU, the party of Bundeskanzler, of the Federal Chancellor Helmut Kohl. So we have a picture there of Kohl and Merkel at a CDU party conference in the 1990s. She gradually became one of the most important representatives of what they would call the new federal states, the former East Germany, within the Federal Republic. And she eventually, by the end of the 1990s, had risen to become the leader of the CDU. This was something of a historical political earthquake that she became head of the CDU. Merkel is a woman and a Protestant from the East in a political party, the CDU, that has been dominated through most of its existence by Catholic men from the West. And so she was very much an outsider within the party, even though she showed herself in various positions in Kohl's initial post-unification governments. She held a position. She was environment minister. She was minister of science, technology. She became general secretary of the CDU. But it was her outsiderness that allowed her to move into the position of leader of the party when the party suffered a fundraising scandal in the late 1990s. Kohl loses election in 1998. And then within a year, stories come out about secret fundraising and secret accounts. And not only does this, of course, tarnish Kohl's reputation for a while, but it also costs his immediate successor as leader of the CDU, Wolfgang Schäuble, his job. And Merkel comes in essentially as the outsider who's going to clean things up. What nobody expected then, perhaps they should have, but they didn't, was that not only would she be sort of a short-term problem solver, but she ended up establishing herself as the leader of the party. And she led the party for almost 20 years before she gave up control of the party just recently, in the last couple of years, first to Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, which is a name that is hard to say, and now to Armin Laschet, who we will meet in a minute. But Merkel has been head of the CDU, the largest political party in Germany, a Christian Democratic party, so a center-right political party, since the turn of this century. And she has been federal chancellor since 2005, which means as of the election in September, she will have served for 16 years, just about, as chancellor, which puts her right up there with Kohl for the longest serving chancellor in West German history. Not something somebody would expect. She has managed to win re-election. She was elected in 2005. She won re-election 2009, 2013, 2017 in a series of coalition governments. She is about to do something that, interestingly enough, I would say that no German chancellor has been able to do, and that is she has been able to go out undefeated. She hasn't been forced to resign before the end of her term, which is something that happened to previous chancellors. She hasn't lost an election. She just decided that she'd had enough. And so she is leaving as of 2021. Her departure, the number of presidents of the United States that she has worked with, right? Remember when she became chancellor, George W. Bush was president of the United States. When she became chancellor, Jacques Chirac was the president of France. When she became chancellor, Vladimir Putin was the president of Russia. He and she are the only two people who have been in office at the same time for all this time. Otherwise, there's been a real revolving door. She's played a very important role as a leader in Germany. When she became chancellor, Germany was in the middle of an economic malaise that she has pulled them out of. She has had to manage a series of political, international and domestic political challenges, which we can certainly talk about, some well, some less well. But she has managed to hold on to office while also dealing with a revolving door, if you will, of international partners. And so she will be leaving, so I'm counting on my fingers, right? Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, that's 4 US presidents, multiple French presidents, multiple British prime ministers, multiple other partners as well. She's been very busy, and she has played a role as in times of international upset, right? Her particular style of management, which is very much calm, technocratic, if you will, sort of crisis management. She's not somebody for broad gestures. The only gesture for which she is famous is the one I have the picture in the middle there, and that is the way that she always stands when she's waiting to speak. She holds her hands in that diamond shape, right? It's become sort of universal that she seems to have a closet full of identical pantsuits in different colors, but she always manages to stand the same way, right? That particular kind of calm crisis management, calm leadership has allowed her to both defeat and wait out many domestic political rivals. Some people complain that it means that sometimes Germany has not played the more dramatic or active role that it could play in dealing with international crises. But she continues to be enormously popular in Germany. She is generally well thought of, even though Germany right now faces a whole series of problems that she's not going to be around to solve. And so this is an important political shift for Germany, for the CDU, for the European Union, for the Transatlantic Alliance, for just about everything you could think of, right? The departure of someone of this world historical significance from the scene. And so what does this stand right now? What is the current government of Germany? What you see here is the result of the last federal elections, the last elections to the German Bundestag in 2017. And the German electoral system, we don't have to go into all the details. There's a parliamentary system, which is built around governments that get a majority of the seats in parliament. What this means in practice is German governments have generally been coalitions of two political parties. There was only one time in the entire history of post-war Democratic Federal Republic of Germany, in the entire history of post-war Germany, only one time has a single party been able to win a majority of the votes. Right. So this basically, it's typical that the vote is fragmented, but the 2017 election was particularly important because of the degree of fragmentation. This was the first time that 6 different political parties won enough votes to get representation. Certainly, it's the first time since the very first elections in 1949, I should say. But that you have 6 different political parties, each getting enough votes to get into parliament. In order to get into parliament, a party has to get at least 5% of the vote or win at least 3 direct districts. So, but as you see, when you have 6 political parties, putting together 50% is difficult. Ultimately, right, in the graph before you there, the black graph, what they call the union, this is the CDU and its Bavarian sister party, the CSU, the Christian Democratic Union and the Christian Social Union. They have a symbiotic political relationship that I've spent my career studying and have spent many hours trying to explain. The shortest version is they are very similar political parties, but the CDU exists in all of Germany except in the state of Bavaria. and the CSU exists only in the state of Bavaria. So at the national level, they form a single party group, the CDU/CSU. That's why it looks like that. The CDU-CSU have governed the Federal Republic of Germany for most of its existence. Not all of it, but for most of its existence. Usually, for much of its existence, the two main political parties competing with each other in Germany are the CDU-CSU on the center right and the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, on the center left. Politics in Europe are different than politics in the United States, so they are not completely analog to Democrats and Republicans. But if we think about them as the Union is more conservative, the SPD is more liberal in the American sense, we'll set that aside. But for much of post-war German history, both the CDU, CSU, and the SPD could count on getting at least 40% of the vote in national elections. And so that meant that putting together a government was usually just a matter of picking one smaller political party to join with them to create a majority. You look at the numbers, however, from 2017, and you see that the CDU-CSU's total was only 32.9% of the vote, and the SPD was down to 20%. And so the two parties that traditionally had usually been able to get 75, 80, 85, at one time even 90% of the total national vote are barely getting a majority of the national vote because of the way the vote is split up. And we will talk about those other parties and what they mean. What this meant practically is, even though usually the CDU, CSU, and the SPD are the main competitors, for most of Angela Merkel's time as chancellor, the two parties have actually been linked together in a national coalition, what the Germans call a grand coalition. And they call it that because the idea is if you have these two parties that are so different from each other forming one government, this is a big coalition. Basically, they put aside some of their differences and they argue that, in order to have a stable majority government, they will work together. This is never, the Constitution allows for this. There had been one in the 60s, but since 2005, there has been a grand coalition governing Germany for most of this period. The only period that it wasn't a grand coalition was between 2009 and 2013. The problem with grand coalitions is that means that you've got the two main parties are governing, which means they tend to avoid difficult decisions, or they tend to sort of look too much like each other, which will encourage the growth on the extremes, or the growth of the fragmentation of the political system, which is indeed what has happened. And so right now, the government is a coalition of the CDU, CSU, and the SPD. Going into these elections in 2021, both the CDU, CSU on one side and the SPD on the other have announced that they do not intend to carry on the grand coalition going forward. And they might change their minds. They didn't want to go back to the grand coalition in 2017. The SPD, noticing how badly they had done, they felt that they'd been the junior partner in this government with Angela Merkel for so long that they'd lost their political profile. And so they didn't want to be part of this government. But the only reason why this particular government was formed was because it was the only possible two-party majority. So where we are now is Germany is governed. Angela Merkel is chancellor. She has all of the authority that comes with being chancellor, but she is at the head of this grand coalition. And the question is going to be, how do the numbers shake out? And I'm going to show you what the numbers look like going forward by the end of this talk to see what kind of government will be put together. But it is very much wide open without Merkel as an obvious candidate that has a clear public profile and has great popularity. Things that really feel wide open. So who are the players right now in the election? So I have here on my, let's see if I can lower that down. There we go. So to give you an idea of the parties, I'm showing you the current leading figures in the various political parties. On the left of the screen here, right, you have the upper left is the leader of the CDU now is Armin Laschet. Armin Laschet is the governor of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the biggest German state in terms of population. It is the northwestern state that includes cities like Cologne and Dusseldorf and much of German industry. He is the leader of the CDU, and he has been selected to be the chancellor candidate of the CDU and CSU together. Underneath him there is Markus Söder, who is the chair of the Bavarian CSU. He's currently the governor of Bavaria. The CDU and CSU, they have this complicated relationship. The CSU often presents itself as more conservative than the CDU, sort of pulling it a little bit to the right. But the two parties they agree on a single candidate who leads them into the election. Laschet won an internal vote of the combined parties to see who would be the leader. He is generally considered to be a reasonably competent governor, but he's not terribly charismatic. He's had a few pretty serious missteps in the recent election campaign. There were these floods in Germany last month, and in those. And while he was supposed to be traveling around with the president of Germany and the ceremonial president of Germany, talking to people about their problems, he was caught on camera standing in the background, sharing a joke with other members of the traveling party while the federal president was giving a very serious talk. Nobody's really sure. Laschet is considered to be more centrist, and the CDU is very much, there's a lot of competition and conflict between those who think that the party needs to be more hardline conservative in order to have a clearer profile versus those who think that the party needs to sort of follow Angela Merkel's broadly centrist course. So that's the CDU. CSU. On the opposite side of the screen here, we have in the upper right is one of the big stars of German politics right now. That is Annalena Baerbock in her red dress. She is the chancellor candidate of the Green Party. She is barely 40 years old. She has recently risen to the leadership of this party. The Greens are important for reasons we'll talk about, that they are the party of, let's say, the young, educated class. They are generally the progressives, right? Going back to their roots as an environmental party. They've also been very much advocates for let's say, Germany's a commitment to democracy, right, in the face of challenges from Russia and from other places, and we will talk about that. The Greens are trying to present themselves as this party of sort of the modern, educated, urbanized bourgeoisie, which means they initially took a lot of votes from the Social Democrats, as we'll talk about, but they also, in some places in Germany, they've taken votes away from the CDU and the CSU because their environmental commitment appeals to elements of the educated middle classes, especially in the cities. And so she has been, her selection as the formal chancellor candidate of the Greens was something of a sensation, both because the party felt like, to actually say you have somebody who's going to be your chancellor candidate means you actually think that you are likely to finish first in the election. Usually, even though nobody gets a majority, usually the party that finishes first is the one that gets the first crack at forming a government and selecting a chancellor. And so that the Greens decided on her and not her colleague, Robert Habeck, to be their candidate was a sign that the Greens really want to show how progressive they are, that they're going to go with youth, they're going to go with a woman, they're going to show that they want to shake up politics. And we'll talk about how well that's been going so far. Underneath Annalena Baerbock, there's Olaf Scholz, who is the chancellor candidate of the Social Democrats. And the Social Democrats, a political party with a long and rich tradition on the center left in Germany. They are some very famous chancellors were from the Social Democrats: Willy Brandt, Helmut Schmidt, Gerhard Schröder. Scholz is facing a very difficult challenge. The SPD has done progressively worse. As you saw in 2017, they got down to 20% of the vote, and they're right now, polls have them polling under 20%, which is really quite catastrophic for a political party that thought of itself as one of the two main parties in government. The SPD is very much torn between those who think the party should move more to the left to try to compete with the Greens or compete with other parties, and those who feel as though the party should be more centrist, right? You think about the discussions in the contemporary Democratic Party about how progressive should you be. Scholz is something of a technocrat. He's from Hamburg, the city up north. The Hamburg SPD is considered to be very solid and managerial because they've governed in the city of Hamburg for most of the post-war era. And so Scholz presents this image of the SPD that says, yes, we've been governing with the CDU, but we're different from them, and give us a chance to form our own government, and we will see what we can do. Now, down the middle here are the three political parties that are all jockeying, let's say, to finish jockeying to see who comes in behind these top three, but also to see what role they might play in the government. And the one at the top there, the Free Democratic Party, that's Christian Lindner, the head of the FDP, as they're called. The Free Democrats are a centrist political party. They are liberal in the European sense in that they are generally pro-free market and also pro-individual freedom. So they're sort of a libertarian streak. The Free Democrats have governed in the past, been part of governing coalitions, both with the CDU on one side and with the SPD on the other at different times. Generally speaking, the last time they were in government was in coalition with Angela Merkel between 2009 and 2013. And they campaigned very strong for tax cuts and liberalization of the economic system. And in 2013, they ended up suffering their worst election result in their history, and they were kicked out of the parliament altogether. They finished under 5%, which is what you have to do to get into the parliament. And so Lindner has tried to make the party come back as distancing itself from the CDU, but also trying to appeal to many of the same young urban bourgeoisie that the Greens are trying to appeal to, but trying to say that their vision is different. And this will make some interesting questions about possible coalitions. In the middle there, that is Alice Weidel and Tino Chrupalla. They are the two people who are leading the Alternative für Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany. This is a right-wing political party that has only recently developed partially out of conservative critics of Angela Merkel within the CDU and CSU, and also from other political parties. They started out as a sort of Eurosceptic party along the lines of the UK Independence Party or other political parties elsewhere in Europe, but they've also become very strong anti-migrant party. They are very heavily based in the southeast of Germany, especially in the southern, in the former states of East Germany, and especially in Saxony and in Thuringia. They are hoping after they made the national parliament for the first time in their history in 2017, where they got more than 10% of the vote, and they hope to be able to at least hold on to that. As of right now, no other political party in Germany is open to forming a coalition with them, either at the state or at the national level. But clearly, the more votes they get, the harder it is to make a majority around them. And so that remains to be seen how they manage to do in September. And then at the bottom there, that would be Janine Wissler, who is the chancellor candidate of the left, Die Linke. And the left party is was put together from some left-wing refugees, if you will, from the Social Democrats, and also from the former governing party of East Germany, what had been the Socialist Unity Party, that then became the Party of Democratic Socialism, and then in the early 2000s, the so-called Party of Democratic Socialism joined with some former disgruntled leftists in the SPD to create the Left Party. They also, they see themselves as being, somewhat on the fringe, but also trying to pull German politics in a particular direction. And most images for coalitions, if the Left Party has been involved in various state level governments, but they have never been in a coalition at the national level. And so no one knows quite how that's going to shake out. So these are the players, right? These are the six political parties, right? See, if we think of the CDU-CSU as one party at the national level, these six parties are most likely to end up in the parliament, in the Bundestag, when the votes are counted. And then the question is what combination of them will make a majority? And what are the issues? I mean, many of these are issues that, we ourselves will be familiar with, right? COVID is an issue, right? The Merkel government, Merkel, of course, is a scientist and as a technocrat, right? A lot of people had high hopes for her calm management of the corona crisis. She has had some success, but she's also had to deal with increasing frustration from a German population that, she's got people who are complaining about being forced to wear masks, about the question of whether people should be forced to get vaccinated. So COVID is an issue, and it's also become especially a cause célèbre on her political right, especially the AFD, which has had there hasn't been as much trouble with migration or as much complaining about the European Union lately. So the AFD, in search of an issue, has set itself up as the great critic of the government's COVID policy. But there is a broad there is still this is an issue. The economy, of course, in any election is very much a question, especially the German economy, which is reasonably successful still, right? But this is an economy that's still built around exports at a time when world trade is being restricted thanks to COVID. There is the long-term question about Germany's role in the world economy, and this touches on foreign policy questions we'll talk about, but it's also very much a domestic thing. And there are parts of Germany where, especially in the former East Germany, where the economy is very stagnant. These are the places where there are the most protest voters, the most voters for the AFD, and the most voters for the left party are in those communities in the East that are being gradually depopulated, who feel left behind, who feel insulted or disrespected by the rest of the country. The environment is a serious question, right? With the question of the Germans made a decision in 2011 after Fukushima that they would get out of the nuclear power business, which we can talk about, which has raised questions about what would Germany's future power situation be. The Germans have invested heavily in renewables, but they also still use fossil fuels, especially oil and gas. And even in some cases coal, even though they're trying to get away from coal. And of course, oil and gas is a huge political problem when it comes to getting that oil and gas from Russia with the pipelines such as Nord Stream 2, which might be familiar for some of you, and we can certainly talk about. The Greens are presenting themselves as a party that wants to accelerate Germany's what they call the Energiewende, the energy transformation, and that's a big part of Annalena Baerbock's message, is that in order, if you're going to have important climate change, you need the Greens in a national government. The recent flooding in parts of Western Germany in particular have brought climate change questions to people's attention. And so people are waiting to see the degree to which concerns about climate change will work for the Greens in the coming election, or whether, as in all other places, right, there is this tug of war between those who are concerned about the environment and those who are concerned about the economy. And so the Greens want to make the argument that it is possible to have fundamental energy changes while maintaining the German standard of living, but their critics, of course, suggest that the Greens are being too romantic or impractical. And so these questions remain very much, very, very open. Then there's the issue of migration, right? That Merkel's, one of the greatest challenges that Angela Merkel faced was in 2015, when a flood of refugees from Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq coming through through Greece and Turkey to the European Union, the question of what to do with them. The states of the European Union essentially punted on the question. States like Hungary refused. Even as migrants were in places like Hungary, the Hungarians refused to do anything with them. They refused to even recognize their existence, because if they had registered them as present in Hungary, they'd have to do something about it. And everybody wondered who was going to do something. And Merkel responded by saying that Germany would take as many as was necessary to solve this crisis. Germany took hundreds of thousands of refugees. There are also refugees elsewhere in Europe as well. And while this has not led to the collapse of Western civilization, it has led to some problems with some social difficulties. It has led to the rise of populism like the AFD, as people have used fear of refugees in order to make political hay. And the longer term questions of, what should the future of Europe, what should the future of Germany be when it comes to migration, when birth rates are so low, and all sorts of other questions like that. These are going to remain an issue. And one can imagine that what we're seeing happening right now in Afghanistan, and the prospect of another wave of refugees who are going to want to go somewhere, that this is going to be a challenge that's going to face the next German government, and it's going to face the Europeans, it's going to face the United States. And then, since we are the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading, and I do speak on behalf and part of the Foreign Policy Research Institute about foreign policy, right? German foreign policy centers around a few fixed poles, right? One of them is Europe, right? The Germans, going back to the days of Konrad Adenauer, right? The Germans have viewed themselves as strong defenders of the idea of an integrated Europe, right? That this is a way that Germany is essentially paying its political historical debts for the destructive role that Germany has played in the past by being a constructive partner within the European Union. But the European Union has some pretty serious problems, right? There are still pretty big economic difference between North and South. The Germans pay an awful lot into the European Union. They get a lot out of it too, right? The European Union provides the Germans with a huge market with which they can sell people, within which they can sell people stuff. And all those people can borrow money at favorable rates because they are part of the European Union with Germany, especially when using the euro. The downside, of course, is when those people can't pay their bills, the Germans are expected to make contributions in order to help to pay them. And that's something that the Germans continue to struggle with. And so the big future questions of the European Union, what's the role of the euro? What should be the relationship between richer and poorer states? Should there be new members? Should there be more political integration, right? Should there be a United States of Europe, right? These are questions that Germany is always in the center of and that will be very important for future government of Germany. Then there is the old Cold War relationship, right? Its relationship with the United States in the transatlantic world and also with Russia, right? As the United States and Germany have developed a tight existential alliance through much of the Cold War and into the present. The Americans continue to view Germany as central to the future of Europe. And so good relations between the President of the United States and the Chancellor of Germany have been very important over the years. And so that will be important for the next chancellor as well. But there's also the question of Russia that to a certain extent, right, obviously Germany was divided in part because the West did not trust the Russians and the Germans themselves didn't trust the Russians. And of course, Germany and Russia have a complicated historical background. But at the same time, during periods of peace and stability, the Germans have considered it their responsibility to act as a peacemaker with Russia, to try to bring the Russians into the European fold. That's what happened in the late 60s and the 1970s. It's what happened in the 1990s. And the question now for the Germans is what role can or should Germany play to reduce tensions between Russia and the rest of Europe, without themselves then being used by Russia as a lever to disrupt the rest of Europe. And this is the question that Merkel has had to deal with. Merkel herself, she speaks both English and Russian, which comes in very handy. The future chancellor will have to decide what to do about this. There are economic interests in Germany that are very interested in ties to Russia, and especially Russian natural gas. Right, Merkel's predecessor as chancellor, Gerhard Schröder of the SPD, sits on the board of the company that is building Nord Stream 2. And so he has a very strong interest and ties to German industry. And at the same time, though, Merkel has been at the forefront of arguing for sanctions against Russia for their behavior in Crimea and Ukraine. So she supports sanctions in one place, but she also supports the building of Nord Stream 2. And that reflects the kind of splits that Germany is forced to do on this question. And so that's something that future chancellors will have to struggle with significantly, is to figure out how do they balance the relationships between Germany's relationship with the United States, which is very important, and Germany's relationship with Russia, which is also very important, but those two relationships don't necessarily harmonize very easily. And the United States at times wants to use the Germans as a kind of translator or interpreter with the Russians, but does the United States trust the Germans to do this without being afraid that the Germans might decide to pursue their short-term economic interests with Russia? Which of course gets us to the question of China. And China, this is where the rubber really meets the road, both for Germany's relationship with the United States, but also the European Union's relationship with the United States and with China. Right? China looms large as a market for German export goods, and also looms large for much of Europe as a source of investment, as well as a huge market. And the question of what, if anything, the Europeans are willing to do to stand with the United States in favor of, say, democracy and human rights? Are they willing to do that in a way that challenges the Chinese, or will they simply, they want the money bad enough and they just don't care about all those other things? This gets back to a fundamental question about whether Europe sees itself as playing a role in world affairs or whether it just wants to sort of sit back in peace and quiet. And the Germans have been on both sides of these questions, and that's going to become an issue for future governments. And I can talk about the role that the interesting thing is we have the sort of the cross-cutting cleavages that foreign policy in particular mean. So we see this is a poll. This is the result of a poll from just last week. And the Sonntagsfrage is the way the Germans call it, is, the Sunday question is, who would you vote for if this Sunday was national elections? And you can see that, I showed you what 2017 looked like, but 2021 probably is going to be even more of a case of, the largest party, the CDU-CSU, might not even get 25% of the vote. The Greens have done very well of late, pretty much doubled their poll numbers from the last election by promising to be tough on Russia, promising to be pro-United States, promising to question the Chinese, which makes the Greens in some ways, better transatlanticists than many other German political parties, which is going to make some interesting questions. And so when you look at these numbers, you can see it might be impossible for any two-party coalition to be created. Now, in other democratic societies, coalitions of more than two parties have become common, but that's a big step, because when you have to put together, when you have to include three parties, now you have even more different interests to come up with. And the Germans love to talk about colors. So the way they imagine these parties, they say, the grand coalition is black and red, but then some people say, well, perhaps the future should be black and green, between the CDU-CSU and the Greens. There is a black-green coalition governing in Baden-Württemberg, very important state in southwestern Germany, home of Mercedes-Benz and and Bosch and lots of other companies. So black-green is one possibility, but black and green by themselves might not get to 50%. And so who joins with black and green? Well, if you get black and green to join with the FDP, you get black, green, and yellow. You get Jamaica, because those are the colors of the flag of Jamaica. And that's what the Germans refer to as a Jamaica coalition. Merkel had tried to put together a Jamaica coalition in 2017, but it failed because Christian Lindner, the head of the FDP, decided that he would rather his party stay out of government for one more cycle so that it could do a better job of competing with the Greens. He so far not so good, but that's his one goal. So there is that possibility. What about Jamaica? The other possibility is Kenya, and that would be black, red, green, That would be just sort of bringing the Greens into the current Grand Coalition, but that's not terribly likely because the Greens and the SPD, neither of them wants to be, they might not want to work together under the CDU. So that's one problem. So those are two three-party possibilities. The other three-party possibility is a so-called traffic light coalition. The traffic light coalition is the red, yellow, green. There have been a few traffic light coalitions in some of the German states. It's a question of whether the Free Democrats imagine themselves as wanting to play the sort of the slightly more conservative free market party in a left-wing coalition or not. The other possibility is the so-called Germany coalition, which is the colors of the German flag: CDU, CSU, SPD, and FDP. So black, red, gold. That's a possibility. The other possibility is a purely left-wing coalition. That would be the SPD, the Greens, and the left. So this will be red, green, red, as some people say. Mathematically possible, although unlikely. You'll notice none of these coalition options include the AfD, because at this point, nobody wants to be in a national government with the AfD. And a lot will depend on what happens around the edges. Over the past few months, we've seen, especially the the three biggest parties, the CDU, CSU, the SPD, and the Greens, have seen their numbers go up and go down. The CDU had gotten all the way up to 30% before Armin Laschet started having his problems with the public appearances during the floods. The Greens had been pushing up to 30% before there were challenges about Annalena Baerbock had published a book, and it turns out that the book had passages that were copied from other books, which is not necessarily a good thing to do. We can talk about that. The SPD has been was down below 15% in some scary polls for them, but they've gone up lately because of the general popularity of Olaf Scholz, who is currently Germany's finance minister, and so he's considered to be a pretty stable guy. But nobody knows what kind of government will emerge from this election, and this is unusual, and it makes a lot of people nervous in Germany and people who observe Germany, because it is unusual for there to be this level of instability at a time when there's already going to be instability because we don't know the personality of the chancellor. It could very well be that we could end up with a chancellor like, say, an Armin Laschet, who is largely unproven at the head of a three-party coalition. The Germans for a long time in post-war Europe looked down their noses at countries like Italy that had revolving door governments where coalitions kept falling apart. But what happens if we end up with something like that in Germany? Nobody knows. That is more than I wanted to say, but I am here for your questions about anything and everything about Germany.
That was great, Ron. Thank you. I don't think you said too much. I think you said a lot that was really helpful. And I pay attention to things that happen around the world, but you can't pay attention to everything. So
right.
An overview like this is really helpful, sort of getting a feel for what they're looking at over there. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
I do wonder, one of the first things you said, the Sunday voting, it's a mostly a day off for a lot of people that people can go and actually turn out to vote. That helps with turnout. It's not compulsory though, right? It's still voluntary voting.
It is still voluntary, and the Germans are experimenting this year with vote by mail as well. They haven't had that for a long time. It's very much, the image in Germany is of people dropping, going on Sunday, going to the local gym or the local church hall and dropping their ballot into a box. And so they have generally high turnout, compared to us, but they worry about turnout. Like the recent elections turnout hasn't been as great. It's only been in the 60% range.
Yeah, okay, that was my question.
Yeah.
And does that turnout transfer all the way down to most local levels as well? Will people kind of pick and choose as to where they really pay attention, where they vote?
I mean, there's higher turnout in the Bundestag elections and national elections, but even at the local level, turnout is still in that 50, 60%. If it goes below that, people get really surprised. And the Germans are funny, right? Because they don't have, it's not like us where we vote in November, in the sense that elections change, and they have several states are having elections going along, and there's actually going to be a couple states, I think, that are going to be voting on the same day as the national elections, and so it can create this kind of weird setup where the Germans always seem to be voting for something somewhere, and all of the political parties want to use those votes as barometers for where they stand.
Question from Randall Newnham: how would the various outcomes affect ties between Germany and the U.S.?
I mean, this is what I've been wondering about, is that in some ways, right, as long as a government includes the CDU, chances are good that the relations with the United States won't change much. And even, I would say, even a government without the CDU, but one, say, the so-called the traffic light coalition, if we had the SPD and the Greens and the FDP, because the SPD has a lot of connections to the US, and because the Greens, for their part, are very pro-transatlantic these days, things should probably stay pretty much the same. If Germany were to go with the left-wing coalition, to bring in the left party is much more hostile to NATO, much more hostile to things. And so that would be an interesting open question. One of the things, it was really easy for Germans to be critical of the United States when Donald Trump was president. And one of the things that's been interesting for them to watch is, now that Joe Biden is president, there is not the same reflexive criticism of the United States, but I also would say that we haven't seen German attitudes towards the United States spring back to the way they were before. That there is a sort of there are people in Germany, especially in the younger generation, who are saying maybe Germany's interests are different from that of the United States, and this is where we start thinking about sort of economic relations with China, or even economic relations with Russia. And this is both on the left and the right of the German political spectrum. But the party establishments, especially of the CDU and the SPD, are still very much within a transatlantic mindset, which I think is a good thing, but some people think is unimaginative.
Anytime we have any kind of a great decisions conversation, China is always no matter what the topic is, China
Right.
comes into play somehow. Russia comes into play somehow. Those are definitely figures that loom large. Another question from David Carroll: what is current German immigration policy?
Current German immigration policy. That's a good question, and it's sort of a current German immigration policy is that the Germans are trying to work within the European Union to establish a common attitude towards Europe's external border, and one that as much as possible tries to discourage migrants from coming to Europe. The Germans within Germany itself, right? People who have asylum claims or migrants, there is a complicated legal process. It is, basically the Germans. It is possible to gain German citizenship, but it is not as easy as it is. This will sound funny to American ears, but our system of becoming an American citizen is much easier than most European state systems for becoming citizens, because it is harder for people to claim citizenship in Germany if they don't have German ancestry. It is possible to get sort of permanent residence. It is possible to get migrant status, but right now, at least, and this is something that even Merkel, after the dramatic actions of 2015, 2016, Merkel then worked very strongly with Turkey to essentially stop the flow of refugees from the Middle East. And so the German government is very cautious in wanting to make clear that their goal is to essentially process the migrants that Germany is dealing with, that they're not throwing the door wide open. The big question is, as a political matter, is if the other states of the European Union are not willing to accept refugees, and those refugees still manage to get to the territory of the European Union, right? If they get to places like Greece or Spain or Italy, if they can't simply be left in those places because those countries are facing huge economic and political problems. And so if the other member states of the European Union aren't willing to sort of share the burden, this puts a lot of pressure on individual European states, and that's not good in the long run. And because the big problem with migrants, remember, is that these are human beings. We should always remember this, and they're not going to vanish into thin air because they're politically inconvenient either. And so I think this is why the Germans would like there to be sort of common European policy towards migration. And yet for some states within the European Union, it is easier just to fold their arms and say, well, my policy on migrants is I don't want none.
It is a little surprising to hear that it's easier to become a U.S. citizen. It's not something I think of as a particularly easy path to walk.
No, but it is. But it's funny because it just makes a difference when citizenship is viewed as a legal matter rather than a matter of your blood.
Yeah. I wonder, besides the obvious parliamentary procedure, parliamentary system where, you got a bunch of different choices to vote for, besides maybe the turnout figures, what are some other surprises that American voters might have when they learn more about the German system and vice versa? Things that German voters take for granted that they can't imagine we don't have, something like that.
Well, and here's one thing to think of, and that is that the German parliament right now has 700 members, right? Germany is roughly, let's say for our purposes, 1/4 the size of the United States. And yet their national parliament has 700 members, right? We have 435, 535 if you count the Senate, for a country that is 4 times the size. So there is that interesting, the size of the German parliament is relative to the population is quite interesting. There are certain quirks to the German system that even the Germans struggle with. And that is that So that number, 700, I think it's 709. I can't remember what it is because it can change. Half of the seats in the German parliament are districts where you vote for a person in your district. The other half of the seats are distributed according to the percentage of the vote that the individual parties get. So what that means is when you go vote in Germany, you cast 2 votes. You vote for a local candidate and you vote for a party. Now you can vote for the local candidate and for that local candidate's party, which people often do, or you can vote for one of the smaller parties. So this is what happens. Virtually all of the district members of parliament are from the CDU, the CSU, and the SPD, with a few Greens and a few other people scattered in. The other parties count on people splitting their tickets and casting their second vote for the party. So the idea is that you vote and they count up all things. They say who wins the districts. And then they look at the percentages and they say, okay, well, if we've got this many people from the districts, we're going to have at least that many people from these other party lists. And then they have to do this sort of math to figure out how many people from the individual lists get in there. And that's why trying to figure out who won a German election. And then we get into the coalition problem. So this is why famously in 1969, Germany was governed by a grand coalition of the CDU, CSU, and the SPD. And in the 1969 elections, the CDU, the party of the current chancellor, got the most votes. They got 46% of the vote, which is quite good, but not enough for a majority by themselves. And the SPD and FDP had announced they were going to form a government. But famously, President Nixon, on election night in Germany, called the leader of the CDU to congratulate him on his electoral victory. And the chancellor at the time, Chancellor Kiesinger, had to sort of say, well, Mr. President, thanks very much. We're really very pleased, but we don't know who won this election yet. And that Nixon apparently then got very angry at his staff that they didn't explain to him the mechanics of the German political system. So that he embarrassed himself by congratulating somebody who ended up not winning.
Yeah, well, he made a couple of mistakes, I guess, when you think.
I guess of the mistakes Richard Nixon made, right? That's pretty far down the list, but the Germans remember that one.
Yeah, another question from Randall Noonan, and I was wondering about this as well. How in quotes Nazi is the AFD? Can they be made into a respectable partner? I mean, you hear a lot about the far right movement in Europe, but are they in line with that? Or are they a little bit farther left than most of the other far right? I
mean, the AFD. The AFD has been struggling with this. Is that on the one hand, there are some leaders who want to, when the party was founded in 2010, 2011 mainly, when it was founded, they saw themselves as sort of conservative Eurosceptics. In fact, they were very British friendly, right? One of the leaders of the AFD, Alexander Gauland, who is from the CDU, likes to wear tweed jackets, and he wears the same tie all the time with dogs on it. He looks like an English lord all the time. It's a very funny thing. And the party really saw itself as this Euroscepticism, sort of tight budgets, Euroscepticism. There are similar versions of parties like that in individual states. There's a party in Bavaria called the Free Voters, which is sort of vaguely conservative, but not the CSU. And so you can imagine that being a respectable position. The problem for the party was they were getting no traction nowhere with nothing. And then in 2015 and 2016, after the migrant crisis, right, that the leaders of the AFD, especially in the East, they began to more strongly embrace the anti-immigrant sentiment. And that meant that the party became increasingly, increasingly identified with its positions against immigration and its positions against migration. And so the party still struggles within its various wings. And so there are some people in the party say, hey, we just want to be a sort of a conservative alternative to the CDU. But they also have, there's one guy who's one of the leader of the AFD in Thuringia, Bjorn Höcke, who's a high school history teacher, who decides to go off and talking about how Germans need to be proud of all of their history, and we need to stop kowtowing to the Americans, and we need to recognize the importance of preserving the pure German folk. And it's problematic, let's say. And so the problem for the AFD is it could very well be, there may very well be some people who vote for the AFD thinking, I just want a conservative alternative to the CDU, but the party still has an awful lot of people in it who know exactly what they want. And it's let's say, and it's more Nazi. And the question is one could say, is this a generational thing? Is this a regional thing? But the problem is that you have relatively young folks who are embracing that kind of alternative. And so, it's going to take a while for the AFD. I mean, the AFD will get its opportunity, or will, if the big thing everybody's waiting to see is who's going to break the taboo that the AFD in various East German state parliaments has kind of embarrassed themselves. But what happens when the numbers are such that you end up with the AFD participating in a state government? And that, I think, everybody is waiting to see. Will that allow them to become, the German word is salonfähig. In other words, sort of respectable. And the left party is facing this problem on the national level, but the taboo's been broken on the state level. And so that, I think, it remains to be seen. But as of right now, I don't have opinions, or my opinions are not those of the War College. But as of right now, if I did not think of myself as a Nazi, I would not vote for the AFD. I wouldn't want to be associated with those people. But that's me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Ron.
Sure.
This is Saul Lash, the current president for the World Affairs Council here in Reading. Ron, and then we have some things to share, Jess, about our upcoming programs. But Ron, back to immigration. A twofold question. One, if children of immigrants born in Germany, are they then automatically citizens? That's one part. And secondly, 3 years ago, I spent one of those little tours around Germany for 10 days, but I was struck several times by the comments and the dedication of people that they're working hard to make sure the refugees don't live in clusters, that they really integrate in small ways within Germany, and that, for example, children 2 and older, they really want into German education so that they become really enculturated at that early age.
Yes.
And so with that influx, that helps with the worker shortage in Germany. Any further thoughts that you can share about the status of immigrations and how things
are going? I mean, these are great questions, Saul. And the short answer to your first question is no, they are not automatically citizens, right? There's no birthright citizenship for the children of refugees in Germany. It is possible to become citizens. One of the former leaders of the Green Party is a Turkish, a German of Turkish descent, Cem Özdemir, whose parents, and he became a citizen. He was able to become a citizen, but it's not automatic, and so that's one of those questions about the legal status of immigrants and the legal process for naturalization that the Germans still struggle with. In the late 1990s, when Kohl loses in '98, the government that comes into power is a red-green government of the Social Democrats and the Greens, and they came in promising to modify German immigration law to allow people to become German citizens and maybe even have dual citizenship. And it became politically very difficult to do. And so it still remains to be seen sort of how the question of citizenship will be worked out. The question of integration is a really good one, right? There is a lot of, a lot of government effort goes into trying to, this is one of those paradoxical things, right? Is to try to spread refugees throughout the country so they're not clustered. Because there's a very large Turkish population in Berlin, especially in one particular section of Berlin, in Kreuzberg in Berlin, because of a tradition of Turks coming in and living there. And with subsequent waves of immigration, the desire has been to encourage people to live in a variety of communities so that they and their children can better integrate into the broader community, so that the kids can go to school and learn English or learn German and all the stuff. The problem with that, this is the paradox, is if you send a couple of refugee families to live in some city or town in central Germany, where people aren't used to outsiders at all, is that they become a focus of hostility. So the same people who don't like the idea of migrants in large clusters also don't like the idea of migrants being spread around. And so it becomes a matter of sort of political messaging. But it is an interesting question, because this is, I'm trying to think of an American example here. And one of the interesting things is the transformation of Detroit in the United States, right? Is we have a large and growing Arabic population in Detroit, in cities that are where the population is, you've got population shrinkage and people moving out of the city, but then you have migrants moving into the city, right? This is, you can see this as enriching or the possibility of rebuilding a city or transforming it, or you can see it as, you know, oh my God, my hometown's not the way it used to be before. I don't live there anymore, but I don't want those people to live there either. And so these are not specifically German problems, but the Germans are facing them too. And I think that's one of the interesting things that the Germans are gonna struggle with. Yeah, and I see the comment from Randall about a town like Hazleton, right? Is if you know, people, and I think about, you know, various towns, especially in agricultural parts of the United States, right? That these are this whole question of, you know, what do migrants owe to the country they migrate to? You know, what is expected of them, and what does the receiving country owe to the migrant? You know, in a perfect world, right, we would imagine that the migrant has a responsibility to understand where they have moved to embrace the at least publicly, to embrace the public mores and the language of life there. But at the same time, right, the receiving country, you know, should allow these people to maintain some of their individuality, right? I think about, you know, there are a lot more Italian restaurants in Niagara Falls, where I grew up, now than there were before 1915, when my relatives started coming to Niagara Falls, right? And I bet there were a lot of people in Niagara Falls at the turn of the century who were appalled at the thought of all of these Italians with their incomprehensible language and their subservient religion and their lack of democracy and their, you know, bad hygiene, that they were all moving into their city. You know, so and I think that's where it becomes a real political issue, is, you know, the way that most German politicians want to deal with migration is to keep their heads down and hope that there is not some kind of big scandal or some kind of wave of violence, because they'd rather not talk about it at all. And they just kind of hope they'll wake up one day and find out the problem has solved itself. And let's just say that's, you know, as we like to say here at the War College, right? Hope is not a strategy.
Jess, I wonder if we might just pause for a minute. Ron may be interested in our upcoming programs.
Please.
And we'll share that. And then, Ron, if you have any final thoughts for us today, we really appreciate your speaking with us. In fact, folks, as you'll hear, Ron has agreed to help us perhaps identify a speaker who could come to us in October to address the whole issue of Afghanistan. Yeah. But coming up next in September 15th, we have Aftershocks, Pandemic Politics, and the End of the Old International Order with Thomas Wright. Thomas Wright is the director of the Center on the United States and Europe and a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution. Interesting title, yet also in September 29, New Wine for New Wineskins, The Way Forward for Caribbean Tourism in the Post-Pandemic Era, with Dr. Pauline Millwood, who is a professor here on the Penn State Berks campus. Dr. Millwood's focus, as I understand it, is to be able to show to us, we all know how important tourism is in the Caribbean. She's going to give us a perspective looking at that. What has happened to the Caribbean, to the countries there with their economies because of the the amount of tourism that has diminished because of COVID. And jumping up to November 17, we had cybersecurity with Captain Paul Tortora, who is United States Navy retired. He's the director of the Center for Cybersecurity Studies and was the first chair of the new Cyber Science Department at the United States Naval Academy. Those are our upcomings. And again, folks, please stay tuned for October. We think we're very close to a presentation in early October in conjunction with the Jewish Federation of Reading. And then we're going to be looking, hopefully with Ron's help and other people's help, to get us a good, cogent reflection on Afghanistan after these maybe ensuing 2 months. So I'll pause off now. I want to thank Ron as president of our organization. Thank you very much. And if Jess or Ron, if you have any final things that should be shared with us, please do.
I just want to say thanks for the chance to speak to you all. And I think one of the interesting challenges in the world is understanding or watching how other countries do this whole democracy thing. And you'll find out that they don't necessarily do it any better than we do. They might do it a little different, but it is it's important to understand the way that democracy is messy and complicated and fascinating all at the same time. And I hope that I wish everybody health and happiness and safety going forward. And I hope to see you all again sometime.
Thank you, and same to you. Thanks for being with us, everybody, today. Thank you again, Ron, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.